The Secret of Widow's Point Lighthouse. The road into Cape Haven narrowed almost imperceptibly, as though it were unsure of its own destination, bending gently between tall stands of pine that whispered together in the afternoon wind. Eleanor Vance kept both hands steady on the wheel, her knuckles pale not from tension, but from the quiet habit of control she had carried through years of careful work and careful living. The scent of salt reached her before she saw the water, sharp, mineral, clean in a way that seemed to rinse something inside her that she had long ceased trying to name. She had expected the ocean to announce itself grandly, with a sweeping vista or a sudden opening in the trees. Instead, it revealed itself in fragments, a flash of grey-blue between trunks, a cry of gulls carried unevenly on the breeze, the low and steady hush of waves pressing themselves against rock. It was, she thought, a place that preferred to be discovered slowly. Cape Haven. The name had felt almost too deliberate when she first read it in the listing, as though it were trying to convince her of something she did not entirely believe. Haven, a place of refuge. She had circled it twice in the catalogue of coastal properties. Before setting the paper aside and making tea she did not drink. 3 months later she had signed the papers. Now, as the road curved one final time, the lighthouse came into view. Widow's Point. Lighthouse stood at the edge of a narrow stretch of land where jagged rocks pushed into the Atlantic like the ribs of some ancient creature. The structure itself was modest compared to the grander towers she had seen in photographs. Stone at the base, weathered but resolute, with an attached wooden keeper's house painted a soft, time-worn white. The lantern room rose above it all, its glass panes catching the pale sunlight in a way that made it seem both fragile and enduring. Eleanor pulled the car to a stop and let the engine fall silent. For a moment she did not move. The quiet here was not the absence of sound, but its layering, wind threading through pine needles, water breaking against stone, a distant buoy tolling at measured intervals. It felt strangely like entering a conversation already in progress, one that required listening before speaking. She stepped out of the car, the gravel shifting beneath her shoes, and closed the door with more care than necessary. The air was cooler than she had expected, carrying with it a dampness that settled lightly against her skin. She drew her coat closer, though she suspected the gesture had more to do with habit than with the temperature itself. The path to the house was narrow and slightly uneven, bordered by low grasses that bent in unison with the wind. As she approached, she noticed the small details, the faint discoloration of wood near the door where hands had pushed it open countless times, the iron latch worn smooth at the edges, the faint scent of aged timber mingled with salt, and something else, dust perhaps, or memory, inside the house greeted her with a quiet, creaking acknowledgment. The floorboards shifted beneath her weight, not in protest, but in recognition, as though noting the arrival of someone new who would, in time, become familiar. The main room was modest, a small kitchen to one side, a table near the window, a stone fireplace that bore the faint marks of many winters' use. Light filtered through the glass in a softened way, as though it had been strained through years of weather. Eleanor set her bag down on the table and stood still, listening. It was a habit she had developed over years in archives, entering a space and allowing it to reveal itself gradually. Rooms, like people, carry traces of their past in ways that were not immediately visible. A scuff on the floor, a nail driven at an odd angle, the subtle shift in colour where sunlight had rested longer than elsewhere. These were the quiet markers of presence, of life lived in small and persistent ways. She moved toward the kitchen, opening a cupboard at random. Empty, save for a single ceramic mug left behind, its glaze chipped near the rim. She ran her thumb over it, feeling the slight roughness, and for a moment she imagined the hands that had held it before, steady perhaps, or worn, or both. "Someone lived here carefully," she murmured, the words barely audible even to herself. She unpacked slowly, not out of reluctance, but out of a deliberate desire to let each action settle. A kettle placed on the stove, a tin of tea arranged beside it, a folded dishcloth laid near the sink. Each object found its place, and in doing so began the quiet work of turning a space into something that resembled home. By the time the kettle began to hum, the light had shifted, softening into the muted tones of late afternoon. Eleanor poured the water over the tea leaves and watched as the steam rose in gentle spirals, carrying with it a familiar comfort that did not require explanation. She carried the cup to the window and sat. From here the ocean stretched outward in a long unbroken line, its surface shifting between slate and silver as the light changed. The lighthouse stood just beyond, its presence both separate and connected, like a sentinel that had grown accustomed to solitude. She sipped the tea, letting its warmth settle into her. For 3 years her days had been defined by absence, an unoccupied chair, an unshared silence, the quiet adjustments that followed a loss too deep to articulate in simple terms. She had filled that space with work, with routines, with the careful preservation of other people's histories. It had been, in its way, a form of refuge, but archives, she had come to realize, were not meant for the living. Her gaze drifted to the lighthouse, its windows reflecting the fading light. There was something here, she thought, not a certainty, not even a clear idea, just a sense, faint and persistent, that this place held more than what was immediately visible, not in a grand or dramatic way, but in the quiet accumulation of moments that had not yet been fully understood. She took another sip of tea and leaned back slightly in the chair. The wind shifted, carrying with it a different sound, something subtle, almost indistinct, like the faintest echo of metal against stone. Eleanor set the cup down, her attention sharpening. It came again, barely perceptible, a sound from the lighthouse. She turned her head slightly, listening more closely now, her breath held in a quiet pause. It could have been anything, she told herself. The wind, perhaps, finding its way through some narrow opening, the natural settling of an old structure. There were, after all, many reasonable explanations, and yet she remained still for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the tower. Then, with a small deliberate motion, she rose from her chair. What, she wondered, had she just heard? Morning arrived in Cape Haven, not with brightness, but with a gradual lifting of shadow. Eleanor woke to the soft, persistent hush of fog pressing itself against the windows, muting the world beyond into a palette of pale grey and softened edges. For a moment she remained still beneath the weight of unfamiliar quiet, her mind suspended between sleep and recognition, until the subtle creak of the house reminded her where she was. The lighthouse. The words settled gently, like something newly placed but already belonging. She rose slowly, her movements unhurried, and crossed the room to the small kitchen. The floorboards offered their quiet commentary beneath her feet, a language she was beginning to understand in fragments. She filled the kettle, the sound of water steady and grounding, and set it on the stove. There was comfort in these small rituals. She reached for the tin of tea, opening it with a soft click, and inhaled the faint earthy aroma. It was a habit she had carried from her years in Boston, an anchor of consistency in spaces that shifted around her. Here, in this new place, it felt both familiar and newly significant, as though each repetition carried a quiet affirmation. The kettle began to sing, a low rising note that filled the room with a gentle urgency. She poured the water, watching as the leaves unfurled, releasing their colour in slow, deliberate swirls. Outside, the fog held its ground. Eleanor carried her cup to the door and stepped out onto the narrow porch. The air was cool and damp, settling lightly against her skin, and the world beyond the immediate edge of the lighthouse seemed to dissolve into a soft, indistinct blur. The ocean was there, she could hear it, steady and patient, but it remained hidden, its presence suggested rather than seen. She took a sip of tea, letting the warmth contrast with the chill of the morning. It was a different kind of quiet than she had known before, not the absence that had filled her apartment after her husband's passing, but something fuller, more textured, a quiet that held within it the movement of unseen things, the slow unfolding of a place that did not rush to reveal itself. Her gaze shifted to the lighthouse. Up close, it seemed larger than it had from a distance, its stone base rising solidly from the ground, its surface marked by years of weather and time. The attached keeper's house, though modest, carried a quiet dignity, its windows reflecting the pale light in a way that suggested watchfulness rather than mere function. She set her cup down on the porch railing and stepped toward the tower. The door was heavier than she expected, its wood dense and cool beneath her hand. It opened with a low, deliberate sound, revealing the interior beyond. The scent met her first. Salt, certainly, and dust, but also something older. Aged wood, iron, the faint trace of oil that had once fed the lamp above. It was the smell of a place that had been used, not merely occupied, and it carried with it a weight of time that felt almost tangible. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through narrow windows set into the stone. The spiral staircase rose from the centre, its cast-iron steps worn smooth in places where countless feet had passed. Eleanor paused at the base, her hand resting lightly on the railing, and looked upward. The curve of the staircase drew her gaze, leading it in a slow, deliberate ascent toward the lantern room above. For a moment she hesitated. It was not fear, precisely, but a recognition of crossing some quiet threshold. This was not merely another room to be explored, but a space that had held purpose, responsibility, and perhaps, in its own way, solitude. She began to climb. Each step carried a soft echo, the sound contained within the circular walls, returning to her in a slightly altered form. The metal beneath her feet was cool, steady, and she moved with a measured pace, her hand gliding along the railing as though reacquainting itself with a motion long unused. Halfway up she paused. The fog pressed against the narrow window beside her, its presence close and immediate, as though the outside world had drawn nearer to observe her passage. She could see nothing beyond it, only the faint suggestion of movement where the air shifted. She resumed her climb. At the top, the space opened into the lantern room, its glass panes encircling her in a wide, uninterrupted view. Though today the view was one of absence, the fog rendered everything beyond a few yards indistinct. The horizon erased, the line between sea and sky blurred into a single continuous tone. Eleanor stepped forward, her hand resting lightly against the glass. There was something both disorienting and calming in the lack of distance. The world felt smaller here, contained as though the vastness of the ocean had been folded inward, made manageable. She turned slowly, taking in the details. The mechanism that had once turned the light remained, its metal components still intact, though no longer in use. The lens itself stood at the centre, its prisms catching what little light filtered through the fog and scattering it in faint fragmented patterns. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the surface. "Still here," she murmured, not entirely sure whether she was speaking to the object or to herself. A faint sound interrupted her. Not the wind this time, nor the distant movement of water, but something closer, a soft, almost imperceptible shift, like the brushing of paper against wood. Eleanor's hand stilled. She listened, her breath quiet, her attention narrowing. There it was again. She turned, her gaze moving slowly across the room, searching for the source. The space was sparse, its contents few and familiar, and yet the sound persisted, subtle but distinct. It seemed to come from below. She moved back toward the staircase, her steps careful, her senses attuned to the faintest variation in sound. As she descended, the noise grew slightly clearer, not louder, but more defined, as though she were moving closer to its origin. At the base of the stairs, she paused. The sound came once more, this time accompanied by the faintest shift in the floorboards near the far wall. Eleanor approached slowly, her eyes tracing the lines of the wood, noting the slight irregularity where one board met another. It was subtle, the kind of detail easily overlooked, but to her it stood out with quiet insistence. She knelt, placing her hand against the surface. The wood was cool, worn smooth in places, but there, a slight give, almost imperceptible. Her fingers moved along the edge, searching until they found it, a narrow seam. She sat back slightly, her heart not racing, but steadying into a focused rhythm. This, she thought, was not an accident. She rose, her gaze lingering on the spot, and then turned toward the door. The fog outside remained unchanged, its presence as constant as the sound of the unseen ocean. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, the cool air meeting her once more, and reached for her cup of tea. It had cooled slightly, but she drank it anyway, her thoughts settling into a quiet alignment. A hidden seam in the floor, a sound that did not belong to the natural rhythm of the place. She looked back toward the lighthouse, its form softened by the fog, its details partially obscured. What, she wondered, had been left behind beneath those boards, and why had it remained undiscovered until now? The fog did not lift so much as loosen its hold. By midday, the world beyond the lighthouse had begun to reassemble itself in fragments. First the suggestion of water, a shifting grey plain that moved with quiet persistence, then the darker outline of rocks emerging like half-remembered thoughts. The pine trees along the ridge appeared last, their forms sharpening gradually, each needle catching what little light the sun offered. Eleanor stood at the window, a dish towel folded carefully in her hands, though the dishes themselves had long since dried. Her mind remained with the seam in the floor. It had occupied her thoughts with a steady insistence throughout the morning, threading itself through her routines, through the careful slicing of bread, the measured stirring of a pot of soup, the quiet arrangement of objects that had not yet settled into permanence. It was not curiosity alone that drew her back to it, but something deeper, more familiar, recognition. She had spent decades uncovering histories that had been folded away, misfiled, or simply forgotten. The smallest anomaly, a misplaced date, a variation in handwriting, a document that did not quite belong, had often led to something larger, something waiting patiently for attention. Now it seemed the work had followed her here. She set the towel aside and moved toward the lighthouse once more. Inside, the air carried the same layered scent of salt and age, the quiet presence of a place that had endured without explanation. The seam in the floor lay where she had left it, unchanged and yet somehow more defined, as though her awareness of it had given it shape. Eleanor knelt again, this time with intention. Her fingers traced the edge more carefully, pressing gently until she felt the slight shift beneath her touch. The board lifted with surprising ease, its weight balanced in a way that suggested it had been designed to be moved. Beneath it, a narrow cavity revealed itself. Dust had gathered along the edges, undisturbed for years, perhaps decades. Inside lay a small wooden box, its surface darkened with age, its corners worn but intact. It was not ornate, nor particularly large, but it carried with it a quiet significance that needed no embellishment. Eleanor paused, her hand hovering just above it. There was a moment, brief but distinct, when she considered leaving it untouched. Some things, she knew, were meant to remain where they had been placed, not out of secrecy, but out of a kind of respect for the intentions that had led them there. But this had not been hidden carelessly. It had been set aside with purpose, and purpose, she had learned, often asked to be understood. She lifted the box. It was lighter than she expected. The lid opened with a soft resistance, the hinges offering a faint protest before yielding. Inside, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had once been white, lay two objects, a journal and a key. The journal was bound in worn leather, its surface cracked in places, the edges softened by time. It was small enough to fit comfortably in her hands, its weight modest but steady. The key, by contrast, was unexpected. Copper, its surface dulled to a muted brown, its shape simple but distinct, with a bow that curved into a subtle, almost decorative form. Eleanor lifted the key first. It was cool to the touch, its weight reassuringly solid. She turned it slightly, watching how the light caught along its edges, revealing faint markings, lines perhaps, or symbols, though time had softened them into near abstraction. "What did you open?" she murmured. The question lingered, unanswered, as she set the key aside and turned her attention to the journal. The first page resisted slightly as she opened it, the paper thicker than she expected, its texture uneven beneath her fingers. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, each letter formed with a precision that spoke of habit rather than ornament. She read, April 3rd, 1923. The fog came early this year, and with it the same quiet that settles into a man's bones if he lets it. I have taken to writing again, if only to keep the hours from folding in on themselves. Eleanor's breath slowed, her attention narrowing. The light remained steady. That is what matters. Ships pass, though unseen, and I am here to mark their way. It is a simple duty, though not without its weight. She turned the page. There are days when the silence feels companionable, as though the sea itself keeps me company. And then there are others when it presses too close, and I find myself listening for sounds that do not come. She paused, her gaze lingering on the words. The voice was measured, thoughtful, carrying within it a quiet awareness that felt strangely familiar. Not dramatic, not self-pitying, simply observant, as though the act of writing itself was a form of anchoring. She turned another page. May 17th, 1923. A small boat was seen near the cove last night, though no record of it passing. It kept its distance from the main channel, moving with a purpose I could not determine. There are whispers in town, though none speak plainly. I have learned that silence often holds more than words. Eleanor leaned back slightly, the journal resting in her hands. A boat, a cove, whispers. She turned the page again, her movements slower now, more deliberate. June 2nd, 1923. She came in the storm. The words seemed to shift the air itself. Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the page. I did not expect to find anyone out in such weather. The sea was not kind that night, and yet there she was, clinging to what remained of her vessel, her strength nearly spent. The handwriting remained steady, but there was a subtle change, an urgency beneath the surface, a quiet departure from the measured tone of earlier entries. I brought her in. There was no question of it. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her gaze fixed on the page. She has not told me her name. The words settled into the space around her, carrying with them a weight that extended beyond the page. Eleanor closed the journal gently, her thumb resting along its edge. A woman, a storm, a keeper who chose not to ask questions, or perhaps chose to wait for answers. She looked at the key again, its presence now more pronounced, as though it had shifted from object to clue. The fog outside had lifted further, revealing more of the coastline, the jagged edges of rock, the restless movement of water. The world was becoming clearer, piece by piece. Eleanor stood, the journal and key in her hands. There was more here. She could feel it, not as certainty, but as a quiet unfolding. She turned toward the door, her thoughts already moving beyond the lighthouse. If the journal spoke of a cove, then the town would know it. And if the town remembered, even in fragments, then perhaps someone there could help her understand what had begun on a storm-bound night in 1923. As she stepped outside, the wind carried with it the distant sound of a bell, faint but steady. Eleanor paused, listening. Who, she wondered, had the woman been, and why had her name remained unwritten? Main Street in Cape Haven did not present itself all at once. It unfolded gradually, as though inviting rather than announcing, each building revealing itself in turn as Eleanor walked along the narrow sidewalk. The structures leaned slightly toward one another, their facades marked by time and weather, paint softened by salt air and sun. There was no urgency here, no sense of movement for its own sake, only the steady rhythm of a place that had found its pace long ago and saw no reason to change it. The diner came first. Its windows were fogged lightly from within, the faint outline of movement visible behind the glass. A small bell above the door chimed as someone entered or left, the sound carrying briefly into the street before being absorbed by the open air. The scent of something warm, broth perhaps, or baked pastry, drifted outward, subtle but inviting. Eleanor slowed, her gaze lingering for a moment. Later, she thought. She continued on. A few doors down, she found it. The sign hung slightly askew, its lettering hand-painted in a deep, steady blue. Paper Anchor. The name held her attention for a moment longer than necessary. An anchor meant to hold fast. Paper meant to preserve. It was, she thought, a fitting combination. She opened the door. A small bell chimed overhead, softer than the one at the diner, its tone gentler, as though mindful of the space it occupied. The air inside was warmer, carrying the distinct and comforting scent of books, paper, ink, a trace of dust, and something else, perhaps wood polish or the faint lingering of brewed coffee. Shelves lined the walls, their contents arranged not with strict precision, but with a quiet understanding of balance. Books stood upright, leaned slightly, stacked in small intentional piles. A table near the window held a selection of newer volumes, their covers catching the light in muted tones. Eleanor stepped further inside, her movements unhurried. There was a sound here, not silence, but a soft layering of small things, the turning of a page perhaps, or the subtle shift of wood as someone moved nearby. It was the kind of space that encouraged lingering, not through invitation, but through its own quiet presence. "Good afternoon." The voice came from behind a shelf, calm and measured. Eleanor turned. He stepped into view with an ease that suggested familiarity with both the space and the moment. Arthur Pendleton was taller than she had expected, his posture relaxed but attentive, his expression one of quiet interest rather than overt welcome. "Good afternoon," she replied, her voice matching his in tone. "You must be new," he said, not as a question, but as an observation gently offered. "I've just arrived," Eleanor said, "at the lighthouse." A brief pause. "Widow's Point," Arthur said, a slight nod accompanying the words. "That's a place that doesn't often change hands. I suppose I'm part of a rare occurrence, then?" "Perhaps," he said, a faint hint of a smile touching his expression. "Or perhaps the lighthouse has simply decided it was time." Eleanor considered this. "Does it do that?" she asked. "From time to time," he said, "in ways that aren't always obvious at first." She glanced around the shop once more, her gaze moving across the shelves. "I was hoping you might be able to help me," she said. "That depends," Arthur replied, "on what you're looking for." Eleanor reached into her bag and withdrew the journal, holding it carefully, as one might present something that carried weight beyond its size. "I found this," she said, "at the lighthouse." Arthur's attention shifted, sharpening slightly. He stepped closer, his gaze settling on the worn leather cover. "May I?" he asked. She handed it to him. He opened it with a familiarity that suggested both respect and curiosity, his fingers moving lightly over the pages. His eyes moved across the handwriting, his expression remaining composed, though something beneath it, recognition perhaps, began to surface. "Silas Thorne," he said after a moment. Eleanor's breath caught just slightly. "You know the name." "Most people here do," Arthur said, closing the journal gently. "He was the keeper in the early part of the last century. Stayed longer than most. Quiet man, from what I've read." "And this?" she asked. "Was it known?" Arthur shook his head. "Not to my knowledge. There are records, of course, official logs, maintenance notes, the usual. But a personal journal." He glanced at it again. "That's something else." Eleanor nodded, her thoughts aligning with his. "There's more," she said, and reached into her pocket for the key. She placed it on the table between them. Arthur's gaze dropped to it, his brow furrowing slightly. "Where did you find this?" "With the journal, hidden beneath the floor." He did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he studied it from where it lay, as though allowing it to present itself on its own terms. "Copper," he said finally. Not the most common choice for something meant to last, unless it served a specific purpose. Eleanor leaned slightly closer. "There are markings," she said, "worn, but present." Arthur picked it up then, turning it gently in his hand. "Yes," he said, "not decorative, intentional." He looked up at her. "Do you know what it opens?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not yet." A pause settled between them, not uncomfortable but filled with a shared awareness. Arthur set the key down carefully. "There's a cove," he said, "a little ways north of the point, not easily visible from the main path. It was used from time to time during the Prohibition years. Boats would come in under cover of fog, keeping to the edges where they were less likely to be seen." Eleanor's mind returned to the journal. A small boat was seen near the cove. "And Silas?" she asked. Arthur considered this. "There are stories," he said, "nothing confirmed. A keeper who saw more than he recorded. a man who may have chosen, on occasion, not to report what he knew. Eleanor felt the pieces begin to shift, not into place, but into motion. "And the woman?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "From the journal?" Arthur's expression changed just slightly. "There's a story about that too," he said. "A young woman lost in a storm, no body ever found." It became one of those things people spoke of in lowered voices, as though saying it too plainly might disturb something better left alone. Eleanor's gaze dropped briefly to the journal. "She has not told me her name." She looked back at Arthur. "Do you believe the stories?" she asked. He held her gaze for a moment, his answer measured. "I believe that places like Cape Haven remember more than they say," he replied, "and that sometimes it takes the right person to listen." Eleanor felt something shift within her, not a sudden change, but a quiet alignment, as though a thread she had not known she was following had just become visible. She picked up the journal, her fingers resting along its worn edge. "Then perhaps," she said, "it's time someone listened." Arthur inclined his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps it is." Outside the light had shifted again, the afternoon giving way to the softer tones of early evening. The bell above the door chimed as someone entered, the sound threading briefly through the space before settling. Eleanor turned toward the window, her gaze drifting back toward the direction of the lighthouse, though it lay beyond sight. A cove, a storm, a woman whose name had been left unwritten. She tightened her grip on the journal, the key cool in her palm. If the past had been waiting, she thought, then it had been waiting for a reason. But what, she wondered, had Silas Thorne been trying to protect? And from whom? The afternoon light stretched itself thin across the shoreline, as though reluctant to settle into evening, and Eleanor found herself walking the narrow path north of Widow's Point, with a steadiness that came not from certainty, but from a quiet acceptance that some journeys began without it. Arthur had given only the simplest of directions. Follow the ridge until the ground dips, then listen for the water instead of looking for it. And she had understood immediately that this was a place that did not reveal itself to those who demanded clarity too quickly. The path was scarcely more than a suggestion in places, a gentle disruption in the grass, a slight parting of low brush that indicated passage more than intention. And as she moved forward, the wind carried with it the layered scent of pine and salt, weaving itself through her thoughts in a way that made them feel less rigid, less defined. She carried the journal in her bag, though she had already committed certain passages to memory, and the key rested in her coat pocket, its presence small but persistent, like a word she had not yet translated. The sound of the ocean shifted as she walked. At first it was distant, broad and even, the familiar rhythm she had come to associate with the open stretch beyond the lighthouse, but gradually it altered, becoming more contained, more deliberate, as though the water itself were being guided into a narrower space. She slowed. Arthur had set to listen, and so she did. There was a difference now, a subtle change in the cadence of the waves, a hollow undertone that suggested enclosure, stone meeting water in a closer, more intimate exchange. Eleanor stepped forward carefully, the ground beneath her feet softening slightly, the incline shifting downward in a way that felt almost hidden. Then, quite suddenly, the land opened. The cove revealed itself not as a grand vista, but as a quiet recess carved into the coastline, its boundaries defined by rising rock that curved inward protectively, as though sheltering something that had long since learned to remain unseen. The water here was darker, its surface broken into smaller, more deliberate movements, and the air carried a deeper scent of salt, tinged faintly with something metallic, something old. Eleanor stood at the edge for a long moment, her gaze tracing the shape of the place. It was easy to imagine a boat here, not the broad open passage of ships that moved along the main channel, but something smaller, more careful, slipping into the cove beneath the cover of fog or night, its presence known only to those who had reason to notice. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the key, turning it slowly between her fingers as she looked at the surrounding rock. "If you belonged here," she murmured, "you would not be obvious." The thought did not come as a conclusion, but as a quiet alignment, the kind that emerged when observation and intuition met without resistance. She began to walk along the edge of the cove, her steps measured, her eyes attentive to the smallest irregularities. The rock face was uneven, marked by years of weather and water, its surface shifting between smooth erosion and sharper protrusions where the stone had resisted. Patches of moss clung in sheltered places, their green deepened by the dampness that lingered even in the absence of rain, and then she saw it. Not immediately, not in a way that demanded attention, but as a slight interruption in the natural pattern, a section of stone that seemed just a fraction too regular, its edges aligning with a subtle precision that the surrounding rock did not share. Eleanor approached slowly, her fingers brushed against the surface, feeling the difference before fully seeing it. The faintest outline of a seam, barely visible but present. Her breath steadied. The key felt heavier in her hand now. She looked once more at the stone, at the quiet insistence of its shape, and then lowered her gaze to the key, noting again the worn markings along its length. There was no visible keyhole, and yet, she thought, there rarely was, not at first. She traced the seam with her fingertips, pressing lightly in places where the stone met itself, searching for the kind of hidden mechanism she had encountered in older structures, where function had been disguised as form. A small indentation revealed itself near the base, no larger than the tip of her finger, its depth subtle, its presence easily overlooked. Eleanor knelt. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the distant cry of a gull, the sound echoing faintly against the enclosed space of the cove. She inserted the key. It fit, not with the immediate certainty of something newly made, but with the quiet acceptance of pieces that had waited long enough to remember one another. She turned it slowly, feeling the resistance of time, the gentle protest of metal that had not moved in years, until, with a soft, almost reluctant sound, something shifted. The stone did not swing open dramatically. It eased. A narrow section of the rock moved inward, just enough to reveal a small cavity, no larger than the wooden box she had found beneath the lighthouse floor. Eleanor remained still for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the stone. The world around her seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, she reached inside. Her fingers brushed against something wrapped in cloth, its texture coarse but intact, and she drew it out carefully, the weight modest but unmistakably present. She unwrapped it. Inside lay a small bundle of papers, their edges yellowed but preserved, tied together with a thin length of cord that had faded to a soft, indistinct colour. Eleanor exhaled slowly. Not money, not contraband, something else. She untied the cord with careful fingers, the motion deliberate, almost ceremonial, and opened the first page. The handwriting was not the same as the journal. It was lighter, more fluid, the lines carrying a subtle grace that suggested a different hand, a different voice. She read, "If this is found, then perhaps the sea has decided to give back what it once threatened to take. I do not know who will read these words, but I hope they will understand that not all disappearances are losses, and not all silence is absence." Eleanor's breath caught just slightly. The wind moved through the cove, brushing lightly against the rock, carrying with it the steady rhythm of water meeting stone. She turned the page. "He told me that the world would not make room for the truth as it was, and so we chose a different kind of honesty, one that required distance and the willingness to be forgotten." Her gaze lifted briefly, the cove surrounding her in its quiet enclosure. A woman, a storm, a disappearance that had not been what it seemed. She looked back at the page. "What did you leave behind?" she whispered, though the question now felt less like speculation and more like the beginning of understanding. The light had shifted again, the edges of the cove deepening into shadow as the day moved toward evening. Eleanor gathered the papers carefully, rewrapping them with the same attention she had used to uncover them, and replaced them within her bag. As she stood, the wind carried a faint chill, a reminder that the day was ending, that the time for quiet discovery was giving way to something else. She glanced once more at the hidden compartment, now closed, its presence once again blending into the natural shape of the rock. "Not all disappearances are losses." The words lingered. As she turned to leave the cove, her steps steady but her thoughts shifting, a new question emerged, quiet but insistent. If the woman had not been lost to the sea, then where, she wondered, had she gone? And what had Silas Thorne risked to ensure that she was never found? Evening settled into Cape Haven with a softness that felt almost deliberate, as though the day were being folded away rather than replaced, and Eleanor returned to the lighthouse with the quiet awareness that something within her had begun to shift, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded recognition, but in the subtle realignment of thought and feeling that accompanies the uncovering of a truth long concealed. She lit the lamp in the main room before the light had fully faded, the small ritual grounding her in the present, even as her mind lingered in the cove, in the shape of the hidden compartment, in the careful, deliberate words written by a hand she had never known. The kettle was already on the stove. She had filled it before leaving, a habit of preparation that now felt less like caution and more like care. And as the water began its slow ascent toward boiling, she moved about the kitchen with measured ease, slicing bread, spreading a thin layer of butter, arranging her meal with a quiet attention that bordered on reverence. There was comfort in these small acts, not because they erased what had been found, but because they allowed it to settle, to take its place within the broader rhythm of living. She carried her tea and plate to the table near the window, though the view beyond had already begun to dissolve into shadow, the ocean now more felt than seen. The journal lay open before her. She had returned to it immediately upon entering, her fingers finding the pages with a familiarity that suggested not just curiosity, but connection. June 4th, 1923. She asked me today if I believed that a person could begin again simply by stepping into a place where no one knew their name. I told her that names have a way of following us even when we think we have left them behind. Eleanor paused, her eyes resting on the words. She smiled at that, though not unkindly, and said that perhaps it was not the name that needed to change, but the story attached to it. The room seemed to grow quieter. Eleanor took a slow sip of tea, the warmth steadying, anchoring. She turned the page. June 10th, 1923. The town speaks of a storm coming. Though the sky has been clear for days, there is a tension in the air that I have learned not to ignore. She watches the horizon with a stillness that suggests she is listening for something I cannot hear. The wind outside shifted slightly, brushing against the walls of the lighthouse with a low, steady sound. Eleanor glanced toward the window. Storms here, she was beginning to understand, were not always announced in obvious ways. She looked back at the journal. If the storm comes, then it will bring with it a choice. I have delayed long enough. Her fingers lingered on the page. A choice. She leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting to the small bundle of papers she had placed beside the journal, still wrapped, though now carrying a different weight. Carefully, she untied the cord once more. The handwriting within was consistent, each line carrying that same quiet fluidity, that sense of someone writing not to record, but to understand. She selected another page. He says that the sea takes without asking and gives without warning, and that we must be ready for both. I think he believes this more than he realizes. Eleanor smiled faintly at the observation. There was something intimate in these words, something that extended beyond circumstance into the quiet recognition of another person's nature. She turned to another page. If I am to leave, then I must do so completely, not just in body, but in memory. There will be those who will look for me, though perhaps not for long. The world is busy, and it forgets more easily than it remembers. The sentence settled heavily. Eleanor felt it in a way that was both immediate and distant, as though it echoed something she had known, but not named. The world forgets more easily than it remembers. She closed her eyes briefly. For years she had worked to preserve what others had overlooked, to hold on to fragments that might otherwise have been lost to time's quiet erosion. It had been, in its way, a form of resistance, not against forgetting itself, which was inevitable, but against the ease with which it occurred. She opened her eyes. The lighthouse creaked softly, the sound familiar now, almost companionable. She looked at the journal again, at the steady hand of Silas Thorne, at the careful, deliberate entries that had recorded not just events, but the weight of decisions made in solitude, and she looked at the papers, the voice of a woman who had chosen to disappear, not out of despair, but out of intention. A life set aside, a story rewritten. Eleanor reached for the key, its surface catching the lamplight in muted tones. "What did you choose?" she asked quietly, though she knew the answer was already beginning to take shape. Outside, the first distant roll of thunder moved across the horizon, low and measured, more suggestion than declaration. She turned toward the sound, her expression thoughtful. Storms, it seemed, were coming, and with them, perhaps, the moment that Silas had written of, the one that required a choice. Eleanor gathered the journal and the papers, holding them together now, no longer separate pieces, but parts of a single unfolding story. If the past had been hidden to protect something, she thought, then uncovering it would require more than curiosity. It would require understanding, and perhaps, she realized, it would require a choice of her own. As the wind rose slightly, carrying with it the scent of rain not yet fallen, Eleanor sat in the quiet glow of the lamp, the weight of the past resting lightly but unmistakably in her hands. If the woman had chosen to leave her name behind, she wondered, then who had she become? And was that life still, in some quiet way, remembered? The morning arrived beneath a sky that seemed undecided, its pale light diffused through a thin veil of cloud that softened every edge and rendered the world in tones of quiet restraint, and Eleanor found herself awake before the kettle had begun its familiar song, sitting at the small table by the window with the journal open before her and the remnants of the night storm still lingering in the air like a thought not yet fully resolved. The rain had come in the early hours, not violently, but with a steady insistence that spoke less of disruption and more of persistence, and now the ground beyond the lighthouse held its memory in darkened earth and glistening stone, each surface reflecting a subdued light that seemed to hover rather than shine. She turned a page. June 12th, 1923. The storm did not break as expected, though it passed close enough to remind us of its presence. She stood beside the window long after the wind had settled, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as though measuring something that lay beyond it. Eleanor traced the line of the words with her eyes, feeling in them a quiet tension that did not resolve itself easily. There are things she has not said, and I have not asked. It is not reluctance, but understanding. Some truths require time, and others require distance. The room seemed to deepen around her, the subtle creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of the wind threading themselves into the space between sentences, as though the house itself were listening alongside her. She closed the journal gently, her fingers resting for a moment on its worn cover before reaching for the bundle of letters once more. The woman's voice lingered differently now, less mysterious perhaps, and more present, as though each page brought her closer, not only to understanding, but to recognition. He asked me my name today, though I believe he already knows that I will not give it." Eleanor paused, her breath slowing. "It is not that I wish to hide, but that I no longer know which name belongs to me. The one I was given feels like a garment that no longer fits, and yet to cast it aside entirely feels like a kind of loss I'm not prepared to accept." Eleanor leaned back slightly, the words settling into her with a familiarity that surprised her in its quiet depth. There were, she thought, many ways in which her life could become unrecognizable, not through dramatic upheaval, but through the gradual accumulation of changes that altered the shape of one's days, until the person who moved through them felt at times like a stranger to herself. She folded her hands around her cup of tea, now cooled to a gentle warmth, and looked out toward the ocean, where the surface had regained its steady rhythm, the storm having left behind only a faint agitation that would, in time, resolve itself completely. The world, it seemed, moved forward without hesitation, and yet, within the pages before her, time had paused. She rose at last, gathering the journal and letters with a care that had become instinctive, and prepared to go into town once more, not out of obligation, but from a growing sense that the answers she sought were no longer contained within a single place, but rather scattered across the quiet intersections of memory, story, and those who still carried them. Main Street held a different quality in the morning. The diner windows were clearer now, the interior visible in gentle detail, steam rising from cups, the slow movement of hands, the subtle choreography of a place that had long since found its rhythm, and the scent of coffee and something sweet drifted outward, mingling with the crispness of the air in a way that felt both grounding and inviting. Eleanor paused only briefly this time before continuing on, her steps guided by a quiet intention that had taken shape without her noticing. The bell above the door of Paper Anchor chimed as she entered, its soft tone settling into the space like a familiar greeting. Arthur was already there, seated at a small desk near the back, a book open before him, his posture relaxed but attentive, as though he had been expecting the interruption. "You found something?" he said, looking up, his voice carrying that same calm certainty she had come to recognize. Eleanor inclined her head slightly. "I have," she replied, and moved closer, placing the bundle of letters and the journal on the desk between them. Arthur's gaze shifted, not hurried but focused, as he reached for the papers and began to read, his expression remaining composed, even as something beneath it, an awareness perhaps, or a recognition of significance, began to emerge. "She left willingly," Eleanor said quietly, as though giving shape to a thought that had already begun to solidify. Arthur did not respond immediately. Instead, he finished the page before him, his eyes moving steadily, before lifting his gaze to meet hers. "That would explain the absence," he said, his tone thoughtful. "No signs of struggle, no remains, just a story that never quite settled." Eleanor nodded, and Silas helped her. Arthur considered this, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the paper. "It would seem so," he said, "though helping someone disappear is not a simple act, especially in a place like this." "No," Eleanor agreed. It isn't. A brief silence followed, not empty, but filled with the quiet movement of thought. Arthur leaned back slightly. There are records, he said, not in the official sense, but in the way small towns remember things. Notes, letters, mentions in places where no one thought to look too closely. Eleanor felt a subtle shift within her, a sense of direction that had not been there before. A cemetery, she said, the word forming not as a question, but as a recognition. Arthur inclined his head. Yes, he said, there are names there that don't quite match the stories attached to them, dates that align too neatly or not at all. It's the kind of place where memory settles into stone, even when the truth beneath it remains less certain. Eleanor's gaze drifted briefly toward the window, where the light had strengthened slightly, illuminating the street in a way that made each detail more defined. "Will you come with me?" she asked, turning back to him. Arthur's expression softened just slightly. "Of course," he said. The cemetery lay just beyond the edge of town, where the land rose gently before giving way once more to the distant line of the sea. And as Eleanor and Arthur walked among the stones, the air carried a stillness that felt less like absence and more like a quiet acknowledgment of all that had passed through this place before them. The markers varied in age and condition, some worn smooth by time, their inscriptions softened into near illegibility, others more recent, their lettering still sharp, their presence more immediate, but together they formed a landscape of memory that stretched beyond any single life. Eleanor moved slowly, her gaze attentive, her steps measured. Arthur walked beside her, not directing but present, his silence a form of companionship rather than distance. "There," he said at last, his voice low. Eleanor followed his gaze, a stone modest in size, its surface weathered but intact. She approached, her breath quiet. The name carved into it was simple, Eliza Moore, 1898 to 1923. Eleanor's fingers brushed lightly against the letters, feeling the shallow grooves carved into the stone. "No record of her before this?" she asked. Arthur shook his head. "None that anyone has found," he said. "She appears here, fully formed, with no past attached to her name." Eleanor stepped back slightly, her gaze lingering on the dates. The same year, the same time. She chose a name, Eleanor said softly. Arthur inclined his head. "And someone ensured it would remain," he replied. Eleanor looked once more at the stone, at the quiet permanence of its inscription. A life rewritten, a name preserved, even if the story behind it had been altered. She turned slightly, her gaze moving across the surrounding markers, each one holding his own quiet history. "Do you think she lived here?" she asked. Arthur considered this. "For a time," he said. "Long enough to be remembered in this way. Not long enough for anyone to question it too closely." Eleanor nodded, the pieces aligning more clearly now, though not yet fully complete. A woman without a name, a keeper who chose silence over truth, a town that remembered just enough to preserve the illusion. She looked back at the stone, her thoughts settling into a quiet realization. She wasn't lost, Eleanor said. Arthur met her gaze. No, he said, she wasn't. The wind moved gently through the trees, the sound soft, almost reverent. Eleanor stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the discovery resting lightly but unmistakably within her. If the woman had chosen to remain hidden, she thought, then uncovering her story would require more than simply revealing the truth. It would require understanding why it had been hidden in the first place, and whether bringing it to light would honour that choice or undo it. As they turned to leave, the sky shifted once more, a deeper grey gathering along the horizon, subtle but unmistakable. Another storm perhaps, or something else approaching, not yet fully seen. Eleanor glanced back once more at the name carved into stone. Eliza Moore. If that was who she had become, then who, she wondered, had she been before, and what had she been trying to escape? The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both new and quietly familiar, as though Eleanor had stepped into a current that had been waiting for her long before she recognized its pull. And in that gentle unfolding of routine, morning tea steeped in the soft light of an overcast sky, the careful reading of pages that revealed themselves slowly, the measured walks between lighthouse and town, she began to feel not the urgency of discovery, but the steadiness of purpose. The journal remained her constant companion. She carried it with her, now not as an object of curiosity, but as something closer to a conversation, one that unfolded across time, bridging the distance between a man who had written in solitude and a woman who now read in the quiet of a place he had once called his own. June 18th, 1923. She has taken to walking along the edge of the water in the early hours, when the light is still uncertain and the world feels less defined. I do not follow, though I watch from a distance, as one does when something must be allowed to find its own way. Eleanor paused, her gaze lifting briefly from the page as she sat near the window of the lighthouse, the ocean stretching outward beneath a sky that carried the faint promise of rain. There was something deeply familiar in the restraint of those words, the choice not to intervene, not to ask, but simply to remain present. She turned the page, June 21st, 1923. The town has begun to speak again, though not of her. There are other concerns now, shipments delayed, weather patterns shifting in ways that unsettle those who depend upon them. It is a reminder that the world does not remain fixed, even when we wish it would. Eleanor smiled faintly, the observation carrying a quiet truth that extended far beyond its immediate context. The world moves, always. She closed the journal and set it beside her, her attention drifting instead to the letters, to the voice that had grown clearer with each reading. He says that there will come a moment when I must decide whether to remain or to go, and that the decision will not be made easier by waiting. I think he is right, though I do not yet know which choice will allow me to remain most fully myself. Eleanor leaned back, her gaze moving to the window, where the first drops of rain had begun to mark the glass in soft, uneven patterns. There it was again, a choice, The word had begun to appear with increasing frequency, threading itself through both voices, binding them together in a way that suggested not just circumstance, but intention. She rose, moving toward the small stove, where she set the kettle once more, the act grounding her in the present, even as her thoughts continued to move through the past. The lighthouse creaked softly around her, the sound no longer unfamiliar, but comforting in its constancy. She poured the tea, the steam rising in gentle spirals, and carried it back to the table, where the journal and letters lay open, their presence steady and undeniable. Outside, the rain intensified slightly, its rhythm soft but persistent, tapping against the glass in a way that felt almost like a quiet insistence. Eleanor took a sip, her thoughts settling. There was more to uncover, not in the sense of hidden compartments or undiscovered objects, but in the understanding that lay between the lines, in the choices that had been made and the reasons behind them. She reached for the journal once more, her fingers finding the next entry. June 25th, 1923. The storm has been sighted further north, though it moves unpredictably. If it reaches us, it will do so quickly. I have made preparations, though I cannot prepare for what she has yet to decide. Eleanor's breath slowed. The storm. The moment approaching. She turned the page. If she leaves, then I will ensure that she is not followed. If she stays, then I will accept what that means. The words lingered, their simplicity carrying a weight that required no embellishment. Eleanor closed the journal, her hands resting lightly upon it. Outside, the rain continued. The world beyond the window softened into a quiet blur. She looked at the letters, at the voice of a woman who had stood at the edge of a decision that would alter the course of her life entirely. "What did you choose?" Eleanor whispered once more, though now the question felt less like curiosity and more like anticipation. The answer, she sensed, was close, not in distance, but in understanding. And yet, as the rain fell and the light dimmed, a new awareness began to take shape, quiet but unmistakable. The storm that Silas had written of had not yet revealed itself fully, and when it did, it would not simply bring answers. It would demand something in return. Eleanor lifted her gaze to the window, where the rain traced its steady path downward, each drop a small deliberate movement towards something unseen. Between storms, she thought, there is always a moment of stillness, but it never lasts. And as the wind began to rise once more, carrying with it the distant, low murmur of something gathering beyond the horizon, Eleanor felt the quiet certainty settle within her that whatever had been set in motion in 1923 was not yet finished. The question was no longer whether she would find the answer. It was whether she would be ready for it when it came. The rain did not end so much as loosen its hold, receding into a fine mist that lingered in the air and softened the edges of everything it touched. And in that gentle withdrawal of weather, the town of Cape Haven seemed to draw a deeper breath, as though recovering not from hardship, but from a prolonged and thoughtful silence. Eleanor walked along Main Street, with her coat drawn lightly about her shoulders, the dampness in the air settling into the fabric, in a way that felt less intrusive than familiar, and she found herself noticing the smallest of details with a clarity that had not been present before. The faint gleam of water on the wooden steps of the diner, the slow and careful arrangement of books in the window of paper anchor, the quiet exchange of greetings between neighbours, whose words carried more weight in their tone than in their content. There was, she realized, a kind of continuity here that did not require explanation, a rhythm that had endured beyond individual lives, beyond the shifting of years, holding within it the subtle persistence of memory, and yet memory, she knew, was rarely complete. She turned toward the small municipal building at the far end of the street, its modest structure housing what Arthur had described as the town's less formal archives, a collection of records, letters, and documents that had found their way into preservation not through intention alone, but through the quiet accumulation of time. Inside, the air carried the familiar scent of paper and dust, layered with something older, something less defined, and Eleanor felt a subtle shift within herself as she stepped across the threshold, as though returning not to a place, but to a practice she had once known intimately. A woman behind the desk looked up, her expression open and unhurried. "You must be Eleanor," she said, her voice warm in a way that required no effort. "Arthur mentioned you might come by." Eleanor inclined her head slightly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," the woman replied. "We don't get many visitors looking for the past these days. It's nice to have a reason to open the cabinets again." She introduced herself as Margaret, and, with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long familiarity, she guided Eleanor toward a series of drawers and shelves where the town's less official history had been gathered. "There's no system, really," Margaret said, her hand resting lightly on the edge of a cabinet. "Things are where they ended up more than where they were meant to be. But if you know what you're looking for, or even if you don't, you can usually find something." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I found that to be true." She began to search, not hurriedly, not with the urgency of someone chasing a single answer, but with the steady patience of someone willing to allow the process itself to reveal what it would. She moved through folders and envelopes, her fingers brushing against paper that had been handled by hands long gone, her eyes scanning names, dates, fragments of correspondence that hinted at lives only partially recorded. And then, quite unexpectedly, she found it, a small envelope, its edges worn, its surface bearing a name that made her pause. Silas Thorne. Her breath slowed. She opened it carefully, the paper inside unfolding with a soft resistance, as though reluctant to be disturbed. The handwriting was familiar. To whom it may concern, there are matters that will not be recorded in the official logs, not because they lack importance, but because their truth does not belong to the record as it is kept. Eleanor felt the weight of the words settle into the quiet space around her. If this letter is found, then it is because time has decided that what was once hidden may now be understood. I ask only that it be read with care and that the choices made be considered not in isolation, but in the context of what was required. She turned the page, her fingers steady. The storm of June did not take her, though it was believed to have done so. I made certain that belief remained unchallenged. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, the confirmation settling into her not as surprise, but as a quiet affirmation of what she had already begun to understand. There are those who would have sought her, not out of concern, but out of necessity, men whose interests were not aligned with her safety and whose reach extended further than this town alone. Her gaze sharpened. Men, not the sea, not chance, something deliberate. She chose to leave, and I chose to help her. The cost of that choice was the truth, at least as it would be known by others. I have carried that cost willingly. Eleanor exhaled slowly. The room around her seemed to hold its breath. She read the final lines. If the time comes when this must be known, then let it be known not as a correction, but as a continuation. The story is not incomplete. It is simply unfinished. Eleanor lowered the letter, her hands resting lightly against the paper. Unfinished, the word echoed softly. She looked up, her gaze drifting across the room where Margaret moved quietly among the shelves, her presence steady and unobtrusive. Did he ever speak of it? Eleanor asked, her voice low but clear. Margaret paused, considering. Not directly, she said, but there were always things about that time that didn't quite fit. People noticed, even if they didn't say so. Eleanor nodded. They still don't, she said. Margaret smiled faintly. Some stories settle into the town in a way that makes them feel complete, even when they're not. It's easier that way. Eleanor looked back at the letter, at the careful, deliberate hand of a man who had chosen silence over exposure, protection over truth, and she understood, perhaps more clearly than before, that what she held was not simply a record of the past, but a responsibility, not to reveal indiscriminately, but to understand fully. As she folded the letter and placed it back into its envelope, a quiet question formed, not as doubt, but as consideration. If the story had remained unfinished by design, then what, she wondered, was her role in its completion? The sky cleared slowly over the following days, as though the weather itself required time to settle after the quiet insistence of the storm, and in that gradual return of light, Eleanor found herself drawn once more to the edge of the land, where the lighthouse stood against the open expanse of the ocean, its presence steady and unchanged, even as everything around it shifted in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. She had brought the letter with her, not because she needed to read it again, but because its presence had become a kind of anchor, a reminder that what she sought was no longer hidden in fragments, but waiting to be understood in its entirety. The wind carried a sharper edge now, the air cooler, the scent of salt more pronounced, and as she stood near the base of the lighthouse, her gaze moving outward across the water, she felt the quiet convergence of past and present in a way that was both grounding and unsettling. Arthur joined her without announcement, his footsteps light on the gravel, his presence as natural as the shifting of the tide. "You found something," he said, though it was not a question. Eleanor inclined her head slightly. "A letter," she replied, "from Silas." Arthur's expression shifted, not dramatically, but with a subtle deepening of attention. "And?" Eleanor considered her words carefully. "He helped her disappear," she said, "not just from the storm, but from something else." "Someone else?" Arthur nodded, as though this confirmed something he had long suspected. "There were rumours," he said, "about that time. Ships that came in without record. Cargo that wasn't meant to be seen." Eleanor looked out at the water. "He wrote that there were men who would have looked for her," she said, not out of concern. Arthur followed her gaze. "Prohibition," he said quietly, "smuggling routes along the coast. It wasn't uncommon for people to become entangled in things they didn't intend." Eleanor tightened her grip on the letter, the paper soft but firm beneath her fingers. "She chose to leave," she said, "and he chose to help her." Arthur was silent for a moment. "That kind of choice," he said at last, "doesn't end when it's made. It carries forward in ways that aren't always visible." Eleanor turned slightly, her gaze meeting his. "That's why he wrote it down," she said, "not to expose it, but to preserve it." Arthur's expression softened. "And now you have it." The words settled between them, not as a statement, but as a quiet recognition of what that meant. Eleanor looked back toward the lighthouse, its structure rising steadily against the sky, its windows catching the light in a way that made them seem almost watchful. "I don't think the story ends with the letter," she said. Arthur followed her gaze. "No," he said, "I don't think it does either." A brief silence passed, filled only by the steady rhythm of the ocean. Eleanor reached into her pocket and withdrew the copper key, its surface worn but unchanged, its purpose still not fully revealed. "There's something else," she said, "something he left behind." Arthur's eyes moved to the key. "And you think it's here?" Eleanor nodded. "I do." They stood together for a moment longer, the wind moving around them, the light shifting slightly as the sun lowered in the sky. Then, without further words, Eleanor turned and made her way toward the lighthouse door, Arthur following just behind. Inside, the air felt different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. The space held the same layered scent of salt and age, the same quiet creak of wood and stone, and yet it seemed to carry a deeper resonance, as though the story she had uncovered had altered the way the place revealed itself. She moved toward the base of the staircase, her hand brushing lightly against the railing as she passed. "The seam," she said, almost to herself. Arthur glanced at her. "The floor?" Eleanor nodded. "I found the journal there," she said, "but I don't think that was all." She knelt once more, her fingers tracing the familiar line where the board met the rest of the floor, her touch more confident now, more certain. The wood shifted easily. The cavity beneath lay open once more, its contents already known, and yet, as she reached inside, her hand moved beyond the space where the box had rested, pressing further, exploring the edges with a careful persistence, and then a second seam. hidden deeper, more subtle, its presence masked by the shape of the space itself. Eleanor's breath caught, just slightly. She pressed. The wood gave way. A smaller compartment revealed itself, its opening narrow, its contents concealed in shadow. She reached inside, her fingers brushing against something solid, something cool, metal. She drew it out slowly, the object emerging into the light with a quiet, deliberate motion. It was a small tin container, its surface marked by time, its lid fitted tightly. Eleanor held it for a moment, the weight of it settling into her hands. Arthur leaned slightly closer. "Well," he said softly, "that's something." Eleanor nodded, her fingers moving to the lid. She hesitated just briefly. Then, with a gentle motion, she opened it. Inside, neatly arranged, lay a set of documents, papers folded carefully, their edges preserved, their presence unmistakably intentional. Eleanor lifted the top sheet, her eyes moving across the text. Names, dates, signatures. Her breath slowed. "Proof," she said quietly. Arthur's gaze sharpened. "Of what?" Eleanor looked up at him, the weight of the moment settling fully into place. "That she wasn't taken," she said. "That she left, that he helped her." Arthur exhaled slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And that he wasn't complicit in anything beyond that." Eleanor nodded. "The truth, not as rumour, not as assumption, but as record." She looked back at the documents, at the careful preservation of a story that had been hidden not out of shame, but out of necessity. Outside, the wind shifted once more, carrying with it the distant promise of change, of movement, of something yet to come. Eleanor closed the tin carefully, her hands steady. The story was no longer incomplete, but it was not yet finished. As she rose, the lighthouse around her seemed to settle into a deeper stillness, as though acknowledging that something long held had finally begun to surface. And as she looked towards the spiral staircase, towards the lantern room above, a quiet realization formed, clear and undeniable. If the truth had been preserved, then it had been preserved for a reason. And whatever remained to be discovered, she thought, was waiting not beneath the floor, but above it. The air began to change before the sky did, and Eleanor sensed it not as a sudden shift, but as a gradual tightening of something unseen, a quiet gathering of intention that moved through Cape Haven with a subtle persistence, as though the world itself were drawing in a breath it had not yet released. The morning light carried a different quality now, less diffuse, less forgiving, and the ocean, which had in recent days settled into a steady, almost contemplative rhythm, had begun to show signs of restlessness, its surface marked by sharper lines, its movements less predictable, as though responding to a force not yet visible. Eleanor stood at the window of the lighthouse, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since cooled, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sky darkened in uneven layers, each one pressing closer to the next. She had not yet opened the tin again. The documents rested on the table behind her, their presence steady, undeniable, and yet she felt no urgency to return to them, not because they lacked importance, but because their meaning had already begun to settle within her, threading itself through her thoughts, in a way that required time rather than action. Arthur's words from the day before lingered. That kind of choice doesn't end when it's made. She understood that now. The story of Silas and the woman, Eliza, or whatever name she had carried before that, was not confined to the past, nor to the pages that recorded it. It extended outward, into the present, into the quiet decisions that shaped the lives of those who encountered it, and now she realized it extended into her. A low roll of thunder moved across the distance, its sound deep and measured, less a warning than a declaration of presence. The storm was coming. She set the cup aside and moved toward the table, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the tin, her touch deliberate, almost contemplative, as though acknowledging the weight of what it contained without yet disturbing it. There would be time, but not indefinitely. The lighthouse creaked softly, the sound more pronounced now as the wind began to gather strength, moving around the structure in slow, deliberate currents that pressed against the walls and windows with increasing insistence. Eleanor glanced toward the door. The town would be preparing. Storms here, she had learned, were not faced with alarm, but with readiness, a quiet, practiced response that spoke of familiarity rather than fear. She reached for her coat, the movement instinctive, and stepped outside. Main Street held a different energy now, its usual calm replaced by a purposeful motion that remained unhurried yet unmistakably directed. Doors were secured, windows checked, small adjustments made with the quiet efficiency of those who had done so many times before. Arthur stood near the entrance of Paper Anchor, a box in his hands, his attention divided between the task before him and the shifting sky above. "You felt it too," he said, as Eleanor approached, his voice carrying easily over the rising wind. She nodded. "It's closer than it looks." He set the box down and brushed his hands together lightly, as though concluding a thought. "They usually are." Eleanor glanced toward the horizon, where the darkening sky had begun to merge with the line of the sea, the distinction between the two becoming less defined with each passing moment. "I found something else," she said. Arthur's gaze returned to her. "The tin," he said. Eleanor inclined her head slightly. "Documents, proof that she left, that he helped her." Arthur's expression shifted, not with surprise, but with a quiet confirmation. "And you're certain?" "Yes." A pause settled between them, filled with the sound of the wind moving through the narrow spaces between buildings, the faint rattle of something unsecured further down the street. "What will you do with it?" Arthur asked. The question was simple, but its weight extended beyond the words themselves. Eleanor considered it. "I don't know yet," she said. "It doesn't feel like something that should be revealed all at once." Arthur nodded slowly. "Some truths aren't meant to be announced," he said. "They're meant to be understood." Eleanor looked at him, the quiet steadiness of his presence grounding in a way she had not anticipated when she first entered his shop days before. "And you think this is one of them?" "I think," he said carefully, "that whatever Silas chose to protect, he did so for a reason. And that reason doesn't disappear just because time has passed." The wind rose slightly, carrying with it the first sharp drops of rain. scattered but insistent. Eleanor drew her coat closer. "The lighthouse," she said, "is going to take the full force of this." Arthur followed her gaze towards the distant outline of Widow's Point, now partially obscured by the advancing weather. "It always does," he said. She turned back to him. "Will you come up later?" she asked. "After you've finished here?" Arthur hesitated only briefly. "Yes," he said. Eleanor nodded, the answer settling into her with a quiet certainty. "Then I'll see you there." By the time she returned to the lighthouse, the storm had begun in earnest. The wind pressed against the structure with a force that was no longer subtle, its presence felt in every creak of wood, every slight shift of the glass panes, every low, resonant sound that moved through the stone base and upward into the tower. Eleanor secured the door behind her, the motion deliberate, practiced, and then stood for a moment in the centre of the room, allowing the full weight of the storm to settle around her. It was not frightening, not in the way she might once have expected. There was a steadiness to it, a sense of inevitability that felt less like threat and more like truth. Storms came, storms passed. What mattered was how one stood within them. She moved to the table and opened the tin once more. The documents lay where she had left them, their arrangement unchanged, their presence as clear and deliberate as the moment she had first uncovered them. She lifted one, her eyes moving across the names, the signatures, the quiet confirmation of a story that had been hidden not to obscure it, but to protect those within it, a life preserved through absence, a truth carried forward through silence. The wind struck the lighthouse with renewed force, the sound sharp, immediate, and for a moment Eleanor felt the full intensity of the storm press against her, not physically, but in a way that reached inward, stirring something that had long remained still. She set the document down. There was more. She could feel it, not in the papers, not in the journal, but in the place itself. Above, the lantern room. The thought came not as speculation, but as recognition. She looked toward the spiral staircase, its iron steps rising in a steady curve, disappearing into the dimness above. The storm intensified, the sound of rain now constant, the wind no longer moving around the lighthouse, but striking it directly with a force that seemed almost personal. Eleanor took a breath. Then she stepped forward and began to climb. The staircase carried the storm upward in echoes, each step amplifying the sound of wind and rain into something deeper, more resonant, until it seemed as though the lighthouse itself was speaking in a language formed of pressure and movement, of forces that could not be seen but could be unmistakably felt. Eleanor moved carefully, her hand steady on the railing, her breath measured, her awareness attuned not only to the physical ascent, but to the quiet certainty that had taken hold within her, a sense that what awaited above was not merely another discovery, but a culmination. The lantern room greeted her with a sudden expansion of space and sound. The glass panes trembled slightly under the force of the wind, the rain striking them in sharp, uneven patterns that blurred the world beyond into a shifting, indistinct grey. And for a moment Eleanor stood still, her gaze moving slowly across the room, taking in the familiar details, that now seemed altered by the presence of the storm. The lens stood at the centre, its prisms catching what little light filtered through the clouds, scattering it into faint fractured reflections that moved with the shifting of the storm. She stepped closer. The mechanism surrounding it remained intact, though unused, its metal components marked by time but not neglect, and as her fingers brushed lightly against its surface, she felt a subtle difference, not in the structure itself, but in the way it responded to her touch. There was a slight give, a movement that did not belong to age alone. Eleanor paused, her attention sharpening. She moved her hand along the base of the mechanism, her fingers tracing the edges, the joints, the places where one part met another, until she found it, a small, almost imperceptible latch hidden within the design, its presence masked by the complexity of the structure itself. Her breath slowed. She pressed it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft, deliberate shift, a section of the base loosened, revealing a narrow compartment concealed within the framework of the lens. Eleanor's heart did not race. Instead, it settled into a deeper rhythm, one that carried with it not urgency, but understanding. She reached inside. Her fingers closed around something wrapped in cloth, its texture familiar, its weight modest but distinct, and she drew it out carefully, the motion unhurried, almost reverent. The cloth unfolded easily. Inside lay a small, carefully bound packet of letters, their edges preserved, their arrangement deliberate, as though placed with the expectation that they would one day be found. Eleanor lifted the top page. The handwriting was his. If you have come this far, then you understand that what was hidden was never meant to remain so forever. The storm pressed harder against the glass, the sound rising, filling the space with a steady, insistent force. Eleanor continued, "There are those who will believe that what we did was deception. Perhaps they are not wrong, but there are times when the truth, as it is commonly understood, is not the same as what is right." Her fingers tightened slightly on the page. She was not meant to be taken, not by the sea, and not by the men who would have claimed her for their own purposes. What we chose was not escape, but preservation. Eleanor's breath caught just slightly. Preservation. The word resonated. It was, she realized, the same work she had done for years, only here it had been applied not to documents, but to a life. She turned the page. We allowed the storm to take her name, and in doing so, we gave her something the world had not: freedom. The lighthouse groaned softly under the force of the wind, the sound deep and steady, as though acknowledging the weight of the words. Eleanor lowered the letter slightly, her gaze drifting to the storm beyond the glass, where the world had been reduced to movement and sound, to the raw elements that shaped everything, and yet could not fully define it. Behind her, the staircase echoed with a new sound. Footsteps. She turned. Arthur emerged into the lantern room, his coat damp, his expression steady despite the storm that had followed him upward. "You found it," he said, his voice raised slightly to carry over the wind. Eleanor nodded, the letters still in her hands. "Yes," she said. I think this is the rest of it." Arthur stepped closer, his gaze moving from her to the pages, to the lens, to the room itself, as though taking in not just the discovery, but the context in which it had been made. "And?" he asked. Eleanor looked at him, the storm reflected faintly in the glass behind her. "They didn't just hide the truth," she said. "They protected it." Arthur held her gaze for a moment, the meaning settling between them. "And now?" The question lingered, carried by the wind, by the weight of the past and the immediacy of the present. Eleanor looked back at the letters, at the careful, deliberate hand of a man who had chosen not only what to reveal, but when. Outside, the storm reached its peak, the lighthouse standing firm against it, its presence unwavering. Inside, the truth lay open, no longer hidden, but not yet fully decided. Eleanor closed the letters gently, her hands steady. Now, she thought, came the part that Silas had not written, the part that belonged to her. And as the storm pressed against the glass, demanding to be heard, she felt the quiet certainty settle within her that the choice before her was not whether to reveal the truth, but how. The storm did not end with a single moment of stillness, nor with a sudden clearing of sky, but rather with a gradual loosening of its hold upon the world, as though the wind itself had grown weary of its own insistence, and the rain, having spoken all that it needed to say, withdrew into a softer, more reflective quiet that lingered long after its final descent. Eleanor stood in the lantern-room as the force of the storm began to ebb, her hand resting lightly against the glass that still trembled faintly beneath the memory of wind, her gaze moving outward into a world that was slowly, almost cautiously, returning to form, shapes re-emerging from shadow, distance reasserting itself, where before there had been only movement and sound. Arthur remained beside her, his presence steady and unobtrusive, the kind that did not demand attention, but offered it freely, and together they watched as the horizon revealed itself once more, the line between sea and sky re-established in a way that felt less like a boundary and more like an agreement. "It held," he said quietly, his voice carrying the quiet acknowledgement of something that had been tested and endured. Eleanor inclined her head, her gaze drifting briefly to the structure around them, the iron, the glass, the careful construction of a place designed to withstand precisely what it had just faced. "Yes," she said, "it did." But it was not only the lighthouse she spoke of. She looked down at the letters in her hands, their pages now resting together in a single coherent whole, no longer fragments of a hidden past, but a complete and deliberate account of a choice made in the face of circumstances that had offered no easy alternative. Silas had not been a man who sought to deceive. He had been a man who understood that truth, when placed in the wrong hands or revealed at the wrong time, could become something else entirely, something harmful, something that stripped away rather than preserved. And so he had chosen, not silence exactly, but a different kind of telling, one that waited, one that trusted. Eleanor closed the letters gently, her fingers lingering for a moment on the worn edges, and felt within herself a quiet shift, not a resolution, not yet, but a clarity that had been absent before. The story was never meant to be corrected, she said, more to herself than to Arthur. It was meant to be carried forward. Arthur regarded her thoughtfully. And now it is. The words settled into the space between them, not as a conclusion, but as an opening. Outside, the final traces of the storm moved across the ocean, their presence diminishing with each passing moment, and in their wake the water resumed its steady rhythm, as though reminding the world that even the most forceful disruptions were in time absorbed into something larger. Eleanor turned from the window, her gaze moving once more around the lantern room, now quieter, its stillness deeper for having endured the storm. "There's something else," she said. Arthur raised an eyebrow slightly. "More?" Eleanor allowed herself the faintest smile. "Not hidden," she said, "just not yet understood." She moved toward the lens, her hand brushing lightly against its surface, her fingers tracing the lines of its construction, the careful precision of its design. "It was built to guide," she continued, "to bring clarity in moments when the world becomes uncertain." Arthur followed her gaze. "And you think that matters?" "I think," Eleanor said slowly, "that what they left behind wasn't just proof. It was intention, a way of ensuring that the truth, when it came to light, would do so in a way that guided rather than disrupted." Arthur considered this, his expression thoughtful. "And how do you do that?" Eleanor did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked once more out at the ocean, at the calm that followed the storm, at the quiet persistence of a world that moved forward, not by forgetting what had come before, but by absorbing it. "I'm not entirely sure yet," she said at last, "but I think it begins with understanding that not everything needs to be uncovered all at once." Arthur nodded. "That sounds like something you already know." Eleanor exhaled softly. "Perhaps I'm only just remembering it." And as the last of the storm's presence faded into the distance, leaving behind a world that felt both familiar and newly revealed, Eleanor felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily recall, that she was not standing at the end of something, but at the beginning. The days that followed unfolded with a gentleness that seemed almost deliberate, as though the world, having tested its boundaries, now chose to move with a quieter, more measured grace. And in that softened rhythm, Eleanor found herself settling into a pattern of living that no longer felt temporary, no longer carried the quiet expectation of departure. The lighthouse had changed, not in its structure, not in its sounds or its scents, but in the way it held her presence, as though recognizing not only her arrival, but her decision to remain, not as a visitor, not as someone passing through, but as a part of its ongoing story. Mornings began with the familiar ritual of tea, the kettle's soft song blending with the distant hush of the ocean, the light filtering through the windows in tones that shifted with the weather, each variation carrying its own quiet mood. She had begun to bake again. It started simply, bread at first, the steady rhythm of kneading grounding in a way that required no explanation, but soon extended into small, careful experiments, recipes remembered and adapted, the scent of flour and warmth filling the space with a sense of continuity that reached beyond the present moment. Arthur visited often, not with intention, not with any formal agreement, but with a natural ease that made his presence feel less like an arrival and more like an extension of the day itself. They spoke, sometimes at length, sometimes not at all, their conversations moving between the past and the present with a fluidity that required no effort. And in those quiet exchanges something took shape, not a sudden or dramatic change, but a gradual deepening, a recognition that companionship, when allowed to grow without demand or expectation, could become something both steady and meaningful. "You've made a place here," Arthur said one afternoon as they stood near the window, watching the light shift across the water. Eleanor considered this. "I think the place made room," she replied. Arthur smiled slightly. "Sometimes that's the same thing." She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what to do with everything," she said. "The journal, the letters, the documents." Arthur inclined his head, and Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the lighthouse, its presence steady against the horizon. "I don't want to lock it away," she said, "but I don't want to expose it in a way that strips it of what it was meant to preserve." Arthur nodded slowly. "A balance," he said. "Yes," Eleanor replied. "A way of telling the story that honors the choice, not just the facts." Arthur regarded her for a moment, then said, "You could create a space for it, not an archive exactly, something more lived in." The idea settled into her with a quiet resonance. "A small museum," she said, the words forming naturally. "Here, in the keeper's house." Arthur's expression softened. "I think that would suit the lighthouse." Eleanor felt a warmth settle within her, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady and certain. "Yes," she said, "I think it would." And in that moment, the question that had lingered beneath everything, the quiet, persistent uncertainty of whether she belonged here, whether this new life was something she could truly step into, began to resolve itself, not through decision alone, but through the simple recognition that she already had. Autumn arrived with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, the air turning crisp, the sky deepening into a shade of blue that seemed to hold both distance and immediacy, and the lighthouse, standing at the edge of land and sea, took on a new quality in that shifting season, its presence no longer solitary, but quietly purposeful. The small museum opened without ceremony. There was no announcement, no formal gathering, only the gradual unfolding of a space that invited rather than declared, its contents arranged with care, Silas's journal resting beneath glass, the letters displayed in a way that allowed them to be read but not consumed, the documents present not as evidence to be examined, but as part of a story to be understood. Visitors came, not in crowds, not with urgency, but in ones and twos, their presence thoughtful, their movements slow, as though sensing that this was a place where time behaved differently. Eleanor welcomed them quietly, her role not to explain, but to guide, to allow the story to reveal itself in its own way, its own pace. Chloe arrived in late October, her energy bright and immediate, her presence bringing with it a different kind of movement, a connection between generations that felt both natural and necessary. "You've built something," she said, standing in the doorway of the keeper's house, her gaze moving across the space with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. Eleanor smiled gently. "I think it was already here," she replied. "I only helped it take shape." Chloe set to work with an enthusiasm that carried its own quiet purpose, digitizing records, creating small displays that bridge past and present, her approach different from Eleanor's, but no less thoughtful. Together they formed something new, not a replacement for what had been, but a continuation. Arthur remained a steady presence, his visits as natural as the turning of the tide, his conversations with Eleanor deepening into a quiet companionship that required no definition. And in the evenings, when the light softened and the ocean settled into its steady rhythm, they would sit by the window, the silence between them filled not with absence, but with a shared understanding that needed no words. The lighthouse no longer held secrets, not in the way it once had. What it held now was something else entirely, a story, a choice, a preservation not only of what had been, but of what could continue. Eleanor stood one evening at the edge of Widow's Point, the wind moving gently around her, the ocean stretching outward in its endless steady motion, and she felt within herself a quiet peace that had not arrived suddenly, but had grown, slowly and deliberately, like something long planted finally reaching the light. She thought of Silas, of the woman who had chosen a new name, of the life that had been preserved through absence, through care, through the quiet understanding that not all truths demanded immediate telling, and she thought of her own life, of what had been lost, of what had been found, of what had begun again, not in defiance of the past, but in conversation with it. The light in the lantern room above her flickered on, not as a necessity, but as a gesture, a quiet continuation of purpose. Eleanor looked up, her expression soft. "Still guiding?" she murmured. The wind carried the words outward, blending them with the steady hush of the sea. And as she turned back toward the lighthouse, toward the warmth within, toward the life that had taken shape in ways she had not anticipated but had come to embrace, she felt the answer settle within her, clear and certain. Yes, it was possible to begin again, not by leaving everything behind, but by carrying forward what mattered most and allowing it to become something new.